He married 3 Apache widows, not for love, but for his daughter's life. The winter came early that year, colder than anyone expected. Snow covered the wide land around the small ranch, turning familiar paths into white silence. The wind never seemed to rest. It pushed against the wooden walls of the house day and night, making them creak like tired bones. Inside that house lived a man named Thomas Hale and his only daughter, Emily. Since his wife had passed away 2 years earlier, the ranch had felt empty. Every sound echoed louder, and every night felt longer. Thomas was a strong man, used to hard work and long days. He woke before sunrise, cared for the animals, fixed broken fences, and did everything himself. But no amount of strength could prepare him for what happened to his daughter that winter. Emily was only 8 years old, gentle and curious, with a habit of asking questions about everything she saw. One morning, she did not get out of bed. Her face was pale, her skin hot, and her breathing weak. Thomas thought it was just the cold at first. He wrapped her in blankets and stayed by her side, telling her stories her mother once told her. But days passed and Emily grew worse. The nearest town was far away and the road was blocked by snow. Even if he could reach it, the doctor there was known to turn away those who could not pay much. Thomas tried everything he knew. He boiled herbs, kept fires burning, and prayed in the quiet hours of the night. Nothing worked. Each cough from Emily felt like a hammer striking his chest. A fear settled deep inside him, heavier than the winter air. One night, as the fire burned low, Thomas remembered something his late wife Sarah once told him. She had grown up near Apache lands before marrying him. She spoke with respect about their healers and elders, saying they understood nature in ways others did not. Thomas had listened politely back then, never thinking he would need that knowledge. Now, with his daughter slipping away, that memory felt like a small light in deep darkness. At dawn, Thomas made a decision he had avoided for days. He wrapped Emily carefully, placed her on a small sled, and prepared the horse. The journey would be dangerous, but staying meant losing her. He whispered a promise to his daughter that he would not give up. Emily barely opened her eyes, but her hand tightened weakly around his coat. The ride was slow and painful. Snow reached the horse's knees, and the wind cut through Thomas's face. More than once he thought about turning back, but each time he looked at Emily, he pushed forward. After hours that felt like days, he reached the edge of Apache land. Smoke rose from distant fires, and the shape of tents stood against the pale sky. Thomas stopped, unsure what to do next. He knew he was crossing a line most settlers avoided. Stories had filled the towns, some true, many exaggerated. Still, he stepped forward, carrying his daughter in his arms. Before he could speak, figures appeared from between the tents. They watched him closely, their faces serious but calm. An older man stepped forward. His hair was gray, his eyes sharp but not cruel. Thomas lowered his head in respect and spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He explained about his daughter, about her sickness, about how he had nowhere else to turn. His voice broke near the end, and he did not try to hide it. A father with nothing left to lose stands naked before the world. The elder listened without interruption. Then he looked at Emily, studying her breathing, her skin, the way her body rested against Thomas's chest. Then he spoke quietly to others, and soon a woman approached. She was known as a healer, her movements gentle and precise. She touched Emily's forehead and wrist, closed her eyes, and remained silent for a long moment. "She is very weak," the healer finally said, "but she is not gone yet." Those words nearly brought Thomas to his knees. Emily was taken into a warm tent, and Thomas was asked to wait outside. The hours that followed were the longest of his life. He paced, prayed, and stared into the fire, replaying every choice he had ever made. When the healer returned, her face was serious. "We can help her," she said. "But help is never free." Thomas nodded. He expected that. He was ready to give up land, animals, anything. "Tell me what you need," he said without hesitation. The healer did not answer immediately. Instead, the elders gathered. Among them stood 3 women, slightly apart from the rest. Thomas noticed them then for the first time. They were widows, their husbands lost to past hardship and conflict. Each woman carried a different expression, one guarded, one tired, one quietly strong. Though their faces were calm, their eyes held deep stories of loss. An elder spoke, his voice steady. He explained that these 3 women had no protection, no secure place in the changing world around them. Their tribe believed in shared responsibility, in bonds that ensured survival. Long ago, Thomas's wife, Sarah, had been sheltered by their people during a dangerous time. That kindness had never been repaid. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had never known the full story of Sarah's past. The elder continued, saying the debt had remained, waiting for the right moment. That moment had come. The condition was spoken carefully, without anger or threat. If Thomas wanted the healer's full help, he must take responsibility for the 3 widows as their husband. Not for love, not for desire, but for duty and protection. It was a binding promise, recognized by their customs and meant to ensure safety for all involved. The words struck Thomas like ice water. He struggled to understand. Marriage to 3 women, under such terms, was unheard of in his world. He looked at the widows again. None of them smiled. None looked pleased. They, too, were trapped by circumstance. This was not a reward. It was survival. Thomas asked for time to think. He stepped away, his mind racing. Everything inside him screamed that this was wrong, impossible. He thought of judgment from settlers, rejection, even danger. But then he thought of Emily lying weak inside the tent. He remembered her laugh, her questions, the way she used to sit beside him while he fixed tools. What kind of father would he be if he walked away? He returned to the elders before the sun reached its highest point. His face was tired, his eyes red, but his voice was steady. He agreed. The decision was met with quiet acceptance. There was no celebration. Simple rituals were prepared, spoken words exchanged that carried weight beyond paper or law. The widows stood beside him, distant but respectful. Thomas did not look at them as strangers or burdens. He looked at them as lives depending on a promise he had chosen to make. That night, the healer worked tirelessly. Herbs were prepared, warm liquids given, and careful care provided. Thomas stayed close, holding Emily's hand. Slowly, her breathing eased. The healer said the sickness had been slowed, that with continued care, the child might live. For the first time in weeks, Thomas slept. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, a fragile hope was born, one tied to sacrifice, responsibility, and a path Thomas never imagined walking. What began as a desperate journey had turned into a bond that would change many lives, whether they were ready for it or not. Thomas Hale woke before sunrise again, the snow still deep, and the wind cutting through the small gaps in the cabin. But this morning was different. He did not only carry the worry for Emily, now he carried a promise that weighed heavier than any winter storm. The three widows, whose names he had only just learned, Ayana, Naya, and Lila, stood quietly waiting for instructions, their eyes calm but cautious. Their lives, their safety, and the honor of their tribe now rested in his hands as much as his daughter's life did. The first days were awkward. Thomas had never lived with women other than his late wife. He had known Sarah intimately, her habits, her laughter, her ways of calming Emily. These three women were strangers. They moved with quiet strength, but Thomas felt unprepared to understand them. He prepared breakfast for all of them, feeling the silence in the room like a heavy weight. They ate without words, their eyes shifting, careful not to offend, careful not to trust too soon. Even Emily, still weak, watched with curiosity and uncertainty. The widows did not speak much at first. Ayana was the eldest. Her eyes were sharp and alert, as if she had seen the world break too many times to trust easily. She moved with grace but also carried tension, as if her body was always ready for conflict. Naya was softer in appearance, but her silence held power. She seemed to observe everything, her mind quietly measuring Thomas and his actions. Lila, the youngest, was more open, though her grief was visible in the tremble of her hands and the slight downturn of her mouth. Each woman carried her past in a different way, but their loss was equally heavy, and Thomas felt it immediately. It became clear that survival would not be easy, not for Emily, not for him, and not for the widows. Even the simple chores of the ranch now required coordination. The widows began helping with the animals, their hands skilled from years of life in the Apache settlement. They mended fences faster than Thomas ever could and prepared meals with herbs and knowledge he had never seen. But the tension between them remained, a quiet line drawn across the room. Thomas tried to speak with them, to make the atmosphere less tense, but every word seemed clumsy. He was a man of action, not words, and the women seemed to know that instinctively. Emily, meanwhile, began to show signs of recovery. The healer's herbs worked slowly, but they worked. Thomas would sit by her bed, holding her hand, while one of the widows, usually Lila, gently wiped her forehead. The child's first weak smile in days was a small victory that warmed the house more than the fire ever could. That night, Thomas looked at the women and realized that their role was more than just a duty. They were saving his daughter's life, and in that, they were becoming something more than strangers. Yet, the thought of calling them family seemed impossible at the time. Outside the cabin, the world remained harsh. The snow had not stopped falling, and Thomas feared the isolation more than anything. Supplies were running low, and the trip to the nearest town remained impossible. He and the widows worked together to gather what they could. Wood was chopped, water collected from a frozen creek, and animals fed with care. Each task was an unspoken test of trust. Would Ayana, Naya, or Lila follow instructions? Would Thomas respect their limits? Slowly, small successes built a fragile bond. The nights, however, were still the hardest. Thomas would lie awake, listening to the wind and wondering if he had made the right choice. The widows, too, stayed awake, perhaps for the same reason. Their world had been reshaped in a single decision, a decision that brought danger as well as protection. One night, as Thomas walked past the fire, he overheard Ayana speaking softly to Naya. They were talking about Emily, about how fragile she seemed, and about the man who had carried her through the snow. It was not praise, it was acknowledgement. Small words, quiet, but it made Thomas realize that they too were beginning to accept the situation. As the weeks passed, the relationships slowly shifted. Thomas learned about their lives, their husbands, the hardships they had endured. Each story was a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength it takes to survive. The widows shared these stories reluctantly, but as trust grew, they spoke more freely. Thomas listened, learning to respect not just their skills, but their resilience. Emily, now stronger each day, would sit beside them, asking questions about their past and their world. In response, the women softened. They taught her small lessons about the land, the animals, and the plants. Their presence became both protective and educational, shaping Emily in ways Thomas could not have imagined. Yet, tension was never far away. Outside their small cabin, the settlement watched. Word spread among settlers, who whispered and gossiped about the man who had taken 3 women under his roof. Some called it scandalous, others strange, and some feared for Emily. Meanwhile, within the Apache community, there were whispers as well. Some elders approved, others watched cautiously, waiting to see if Thomas could uphold his promise without dishonor. Every glance from a stranger reminded him that his actions were under scrutiny. Mistakes could cost not only his daughter's life, but also the fragile peace he had established. Despite the difficulties, small victories appeared daily. Emily learned to walk without assistance again. Meals became communal, filled with quiet conversation rather than silence. The widows began to joke softly, first with each other, then with Thomas. These small moments, almost invisible to the outside world, were proof that survival was more than a physical act. It was emotional, spiritual, and social. Trust was being built step by step alongside the routines of the ranch. Thomas, for his part, found himself changing as well. He realized that leadership was not about giving orders, but about listening. He watched the widows guide Emily through exercises to strengthen her body. He learned that Ayana could spot a sick animal before it showed visible signs. Naya had a gift for finding edible plants in the frozen snow. Lila had patience that surpassed anyone he had ever known. Slowly, he began to respect them, not only as helpers but as equals, in a household held together by necessity and survival. One afternoon, a sudden blizzard trapped them inside the cabin for 3 days. The fire burned low and supplies were scarce. At first, panic rose in Thomas's chest, but then, seeing the widows work efficiently, sharing food, keeping Emily warm, and maintaining the fire, he understood that they were not merely surviving. They were thriving together. In those hours, an unspoken bond was formed. Words were few, but understanding passed silently. He realized that family was not always chosen by love. Sometimes it was chosen by necessity, duty, and shared hardship. By the end of the month, Emily was walking and laughing again. Thomas could finally breathe without fear, shadowing every moment. The widows had proven their skill, patience, and loyalty. The cabin was still small, the snow still deep, but inside, a new life was taking shape. The unusual household had begun to function like a family, each member aware of their place, responsibilities, and value. Thomas also learned that acceptance did not mean love, at least not yet. His feelings for the widows were complex, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and cautious admiration. But the world outside would never understand their bond. It did not matter. What mattered was Emily, her safety, and the trust they had built. The challenge of survival had created a bridge between 2 very different worlds, and over time, Thomas began to see a future where, though unconventional, the household could endure. At night, as snow fell softly against the roof, Thomas would sit with Emily in his lap, Ayana mending clothes nearby, Naya tending the fire, and Leela reading quietly to the child. It was not love in the way stories spoke of love, but it was life, protection, and mutual respect. In that quiet moment, Thomas realized that he had not only saved his daughter's life, but had begun to create a home where three women, a girl, and a man could coexist in harmony, each one learning from the other. The long winter was far from over, and dangers still waited in the world beyond the snow. But Thomas knew one thing: survival was no longer a lonely struggle. It was a shared journey, a difficult path bound by necessity, respect, and the hope that the little girl in his arms would grow up surrounded by care she could trust. And for the first time in many weeks, Thomas allowed himself to imagine that perhaps through this extraordinary arrangement, something enduring could grow. A family shaped by sacrifice, courage, and the quiet strength of those who had survived loss and chosen to live again together. Life in the cabin had begun to settle into a rhythm, though it was far from easy. Thomas woke early, as always, and moved through the chores that kept the ranch alive. The snow was slowly melting, revealing patches of frozen earth and dead grass, but the work never seemed to end. The widows, Ayana, Naya, and Lila, had begun helping in ways Thomas had never imagined. Each of them brought knowledge from their lives in the Apache community, knowledge about the land, the animals, and survival itself. They did not always agree on the best way to do things, and that often led to quiet arguments. But slowly, they began to complement each other. The mornings were often cold, but inside the cabin the women worked tirelessly to prepare meals, repair clothing, and tend to Emily. The child was growing stronger every day, her laughter returning like sunlight after a storm. Yet even with her recovery, tension remained. Living together under such unusual circumstances was not easy. Thomas was learning to adjust to the presence of three grown women in his home. Their customs, their ways of speaking, their quiet glances and gestures, all were foreign to him. He found himself watching them, trying to understand when to speak, when to step back, and how to treat each of them with respect. Emily had begun to notice the changes, too. She would ask questions about the widows, asking why they had no husbands, or why they moved differently than her mother used to. The women responded with patience, teaching her small lessons about the land and the animals. Ayana would show Emily how to spot tracks in the mud. Naya taught her which plants could be used for medicine, and Lila told her stories of the stars, of old legends and lessons for children. In these moments, Emily's laughter returned, soft and bright, and Thomas felt relief he had not known in months. Even as the days passed, the house was filled with challenges. Each of the widows had her own way of approaching work, and Thomas often had to mediate between them. Ayana was firm and direct, insisting that chores be done quickly and correctly. Naya was careful and deliberate, often taking more time to observe the details before acting. Lila, still grieving quietly for her past, sometimes struggled to keep pace with the others. At first, Thomas felt frustrated, but slowly he learned to appreciate their differences. He began to see that their varying methods were not weaknesses, but strengths, and that together they could achieve more than he ever could alone. One afternoon, while mending the fence near the creek, Thomas realized that something deeper was changing. The widows no longer treated him solely as the man who had brought them into this unusual arrangement. They were beginning to trust him, to rely on his decisions, and in small ways, to look to him for guidance. At the same time, Thomas began to see them not just as protectors of Emily, but as individuals with wisdom, courage, and strength. This realization was both comforting and daunting. He was responsible for more than a child now. He was responsible for three lives in a way he had never imagined. Despite their growing trust, challenges continued. The world outside the cabin did not approve of this unusual household. Settlers passing nearby would whisper and stare, and Thomas could feel their judgment even if they did not speak directly to him. The Apache community, too, watched carefully. Elders would occasionally send messages through the widows, reminding Thomas that his actions reflected not only on himself, but also on the women in their tribe. This constant scrutiny made every decision heavier. One mistake could ruin the fragile balance they had built, and Thomas was acutely aware of that. The daily work of survival was hard, but it was also a teacher. Thomas learned the value of patience, of listening before acting. He observed the widows, noticing how they handled Emily when she was scared or upset, how they prepared food with care, how they healed minor injuries with herbs and natural remedies. He learned that authority did not come from force or orders, but from respect, understanding, and shared responsibility. Slowly, he began to adapt to the new household, learning when to take the lead and when to step back. Evenings became the quietest time in the cabin. The fire burned low, and the wind outside howled against the walls. Thomas would sit with Emily on his lap while the widows worked nearby, their hands busy but their presence comforting. Sometimes they would share small stories or quietly teach Emily songs or lessons about the land. Laughter began to return to the cabin, soft and careful at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. Thomas realized that though love had not brought them together, a different kind of bond was forming, one built on shared purpose, trust, and care. The widows also began teaching Thomas about their customs. At first, he struggled to understand. Their world was different from his own, with rules and traditions he had never encountered. He asked questions carefully, trying not to offend. Ayana would explain the meaning behind small rituals. Naya would show him how certain actions demonstrated respect, and Leela would describe lessons from her childhood. Thomas listened and learned, slowly realizing that these traditions were not limitations but guidance, ways to navigate a world that often demanded resilience and cooperation. Conflict, however, was never far away. One day, a dispute arose over how to care for a sick animal. Thomas wanted to move it to the barn quickly, while Ayana insisted on a specific treatment she had learned from her tribe. Voices were raised, tension flared, and Emily's frightened cries cut through the room. Thomas realized that patience was required not just for survival, but for harmony. He took a deep breath, listened carefully, and together they found a solution that combined his knowledge with hers. The moment passed, leaving behind a quiet understanding. Mistakes would happen, but the household could survive them if they worked together. Winter began to turn to spring, and the snow melted into muddy earth. The ranch slowly became livable again, though the work never ceased. The widows helped plant seeds, repair fences, and care for the animals. Thomas began to appreciate their resilience, realizing that their presence was not a burden, but a blessing. Emily thrived under their guidance, learning to walk, run, and explore safely. Slowly, the cabin became not just a shelter, but a home, a place where life, growth, and trust could coexist. Thomas also began to reflect on his own heart. He realized that while he did not love the widows as he had loved Sarah, he had begun to feel respect, admiration, and gratitude. These feelings were complicated, but they were real. He was not trying to replace his wife. He was learning to accept the present and the unusual family that had formed around him. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future where they could survive together, not because of obligation alone, but because of shared care and responsibility. One day, as the sun rose over the melting snow, Thomas noticed how the widows had begun to interact naturally with each other. Small gestures of kindness appeared, A shared glance, a gentle touch when helping Emily, laughter over small mistakes. These moments were subtle, almost invisible, but they spoke of a bond growing among them. Thomas understood that survival had created connections deeper than friendship or duty. In the quiet of the early morning, he felt hope. A hope that they could continue, not just to live, but to thrive as a family, unusual though it may be. By the end of spring, Emily was well enough to explore the yard, her small hands holding on to Lila's, then Ayana's, learning from each of them in turn. Naya taught her about herbs and plants, while Thomas showed her how to care for the animals. Together they laughed, stumbled, and learned. The cabin, once filled with silence and tension, was now alive with the sounds of life. Footsteps, chatter, and laughter. Thomas realized that though the beginnings had been hard, the future was bright in ways he had never imagined. The world outside still held danger and judgment. Settlers would occasionally whisper about the unusual household, and Thomas knew that some would never understand. But inside the cabin, a different world existed, a world of cooperation, trust, and survival. Each member of the household had found their place. Thomas as protector and father, Ayana as guide and teacher, Naya as observer and healer, Lila as nurturer and storyteller, and Emily as the heart that held them all together. Thomas sometimes thought back to the day he had first brought Emily to the Apache settlement. He remembered the fear, the snow, the uncertainty. He had never imagined that the promise he made in desperation would lead to a life so rich, so complicated, and so full of quiet victories. Survival had forced them together, but trust, care, and respect had turned their arrangement into something meaningful. Though love had not started the journey, it began to grow slowly, in small ways, through laughter, learning, and shared purpose. As the sun set on the cabin one evening, Thomas watched the widows sitting together, quietly repairing clothes while Emily played nearby. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. They were not a perfect family in the way the world might define it, but they were a family nonetheless. Together they had faced sickness, cold, fear, and uncertainty, and had begun to emerge stronger. Thomas knew that the months ahead would hold new challenges, but for the first time he felt ready to face them. Not alone, but together with those who had become his family in the truest sense of the word. The long winter had tested them all, but spring had brought new beginnings. The widows were no longer strangers. Thomas was no longer alone, and Emily's laughter filled the cabin like sunlight through the trees. Each day brought new lessons, small victories, and the quiet growth of trust. And though the world outside might never understand their unusual household, inside the cabin life moved forward, stronger, safer, and more alive than it had ever been before. The warmth of spring brought relief to the small cabin, but Thomas knew that peace was always fragile. Life on the frontier was never truly safe, and danger often arrived without warning. One morning, while Thomas tended to the animals near the creek, he noticed footprints in the soft mud. At first, he thought it might be a wandering animal, but the prints were too deliberate, too large. They belonged to people. His heart tightened. The settlers who had whispered about his unusual household had not forgotten. Worse, old enemies from the Apache lands might see an opportunity to claim dishonor or revenge. Thomas hurried back to the cabin, calling out softly for Emily. She came running, her laughter still bright, though now tinged with caution. Inside, the widows were already aware of the approaching danger. Ayana had been watching the forest line carefully. Naya had noticed the footprints first, and Lila had gone to check the fences and animals for safety. They moved quickly, almost silently, to prepare. Thomas realized that though he had learned much from them, He still had much to learn about survival in this unpredictable land. Soon, men appeared on the ridge above the cabin. They were strangers to Thomas, but their intentions were clear. Some were settlers, men who saw the unusual household as scandalous. Others were old enemies from past conflicts, men who had held grudges against both settlers and Apache families. They shouted accusations, calling Thomas a traitor, a breaker of rules, and a man who had overstepped boundaries. The widows gathered near him, forming a quiet wall of strength and calm determination. Thomas's first instinct was fear, but he quickly realized that fear alone would not protect his family. The confrontation was tense. Words were exchanged, but it was clear that violence could erupt at any moment. Thomas tried to reason, explaining that his actions were born of necessity, that he was protecting his child, and that the widows were under his care as part of an arrangement recognized by their tribe. Some men listened, some did not. The tension grew, and Thomas felt Emily's small hand clutch his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. He looked at the widows, seeking reassurance, and found it in their calm, steady faces. Ayana moved forward slightly, signaling that she would handle the negotiation with quiet authority. Hours passed as words were exchanged, some sharp, some cautious. Ayana's voice, firm yet controlled, reminded the men that Emily's life was at stake, that Thomas had acted out of necessity, and that attacking them would bring consequences they could not predict. Naya stepped forward, demonstrating knowledge of the land and the risks they would face if the situation escalated. Leela, always gentle, kept Emily calm, speaking softly to the child, showing her that the adults could handle the danger. Together, the three widows formed a wall of intelligence, courage, and authority that Thomas could not have managed alone. Finally, the men retreated, grumbling and uneasy, realizing that the unusual household was not weak and that its members would not be intimidated. Thomas exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. He looked at the widows and Emily, gratitude filling his chest. It was clear that the strength of their small family was not only in numbers, but in trust, courage, and unity. Each member had a role to play, and together they had protected what was most precious. Even after the threat had passed, Thomas knew that life would not become simple. The world outside their cabin would continue to judge, and challenges would continue to appear. But he also understood something important. The bond they had formed was real. It was not born of love, at least not in the romantic sense, but it was born of shared purpose, of sacrifice, and of the determination to protect one another. That bond was stronger than fear, stronger than judgment, and stronger than any outsider could break. In the days that followed, Thomas and the widows focused on rebuilding calm within the cabin. Emily was encouraged to play again, to explore safely, and to ask questions about the world around her. The widows taught her more lessons: Ayana in the care of animals, Naya in observing the land and understanding plants, and Lila in the stories of their people. Emily listened eagerly, learning not just facts, but lessons in courage, patience, and respect. Thomas watched, realizing that his daughter was growing stronger not only in body, but in mind and spirit. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in. Dark clouds covered the sun, and wind began to howl through the valley. The cabin shook, and the animals were restless. Thomas quickly moved to secure the doors and windows while the widows calmed Emily and prepared the animals for shelter. The storm was harsh, lasting through the night, but they survived without harm. When dawn finally came, Thomas looked outside at the damage. The fences were bent and branches had fallen, but inside the cabin, everyone was safe. He realized that survival required not just strength, but teamwork, foresight, and courage. He had learned these lessons from the widows as much as from his own experience. As the weeks went on, life settled into a careful routine again. Emily grew more confident, exploring the land under the watchful eyes of her caretakers. Thomas continued to repair fences, tend animals, and prepare for the coming planting season. The widows taught him to notice small signs in the weather, the soil, and the animals, sharing knowledge that had been passed down for generations. He realized that their presence had not only saved his daughter's life, but had also transformed the ranch itself, making it stronger, more resilient, and better prepared for the harsh realities of the frontier. Yet even in moments of calm, Thomas noticed small tensions that reminded him that trust was still fragile. The widows occasionally argued, their differences in approach causing friction. Ayana's insistence on strict discipline sometimes clashed with Leela's gentler methods. Naya, ever observant, often served as the mediator, finding compromises that kept the household functioning. Thomas learned to step back, letting the widows resolve their differences while providing guidance when necessary. It was a delicate balance, but one that gradually strengthened the household, creating bonds built not on ease, but on patience, respect, and shared responsibility. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Thomas and the widows sat together outside the cabin, watching Emily chase small animals in the fading light. The wind had softened, and the air carried the smell of damp earth and growing grass. Thomas reflected on how far they had come, from fear and uncertainty to trust and cooperation. He realized that while the world outside might never understand their household, inside the cabin they had built something extraordinary, a family born of necessity, strengthened by courage, and held together by care. Even with this progress, Thomas knew challenges were still ahead. Settlers and tribal observers alike continued to watch, waiting for a mistake, a moment of weakness. He understood that one wrong move could undo everything they had worked for. But he also knew that the strength of their bond was now their greatest weapon. The household had survived threats, storms, and illness. They had learned to communicate without words, to trust instincts, and to act in harmony. That unity would carry them through whatever came next. As the night deepened, Thomas went to Emily's room, finding her asleep under the warm blankets. He kissed her forehead and whispered a quiet promise that he would always protect her. Then he joined the widows, who were sitting quietly by the fire. No words were necessary. They all understood the weight of the day, the dangers they had faced, and the commitment that bound them together. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls, and Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned that family was not always built from love, but from trust, courage, and the willingness to face life's dangers together. In the weeks that followed, Thomas continued to prepare for the future. He strengthened fences, repaired roofs, and planted seeds for the coming months. The widows worked alongside him, each taking responsibility for different tasks, their knowledge and skill shaping the ranch in ways he could not have imagined. Emily continued to grow, her laughter returning fully, her curiosity expanding, and her spirit strengthened by the lessons she learned from all four adults. Together they faced the world as a unit, resilient and capable, prepared for challenges both expected and unforeseen. By summer, the ranch had transformed. What had once been a fragile, struggling property was now a thriving homestead. Crops were planted, animals were healthy, and Emily ran freely across the yard, surrounded by those who cared for her. The widows had found a place not just of survival, but of purpose and respect. Thomas had grown as well, learning patience, humility, and the importance of listening. Their unusual household had become a home in the truest sense, a place of safety, growth, and quiet joy. Thomas sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He remembered the fear and desperation of the early winter, the cold snow, and Emily's sickness, He remembered the first meeting with the widows, the difficult decision he had made, and the promise he had kept. None of it had been easy, but every challenge had strengthened their bonds. He realized that survival was not just about keeping the body alive. It was about nurturing trust, building respect, and creating a life worth living. As the sun set one evening, Thomas watched Emily play with the widows in the yard, their laughter carrying across the fields. He understood that the greatest victories were not measured in crops or animals, but in the safety, happiness, and growth of the people around him. He had learned that family could be unconventional, love could take many forms, and courage could be quiet but powerful. Together they had faced danger, fear, and uncertainty, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. Years passed quietly on the small ranch, though quiet never meant easy. The seasons continued to change, bringing harsh winters, hot summers, and unpredictable storms. But the household that Thomas Hale had built was now strong, resilient, and united. Emily had grown into a bright, confident girl, full of curiosity and courage. She ran through the fields without fear, explored the creek with nimble feet, and learned from all three women who had become her mothers in every sense except birth. Ayana taught her strength, Naya taught her wisdom, and Leela taught her kindness and stories of the world beyond the ranch. Thomas watched Emily one afternoon as she climbed a small hill with Leela's hand guiding her. The wind tugged at their hair, the sun warmed their backs, and birds flew overhead in the clear sky. He could hardly believe how far they had come. Once Emily had been frail, sick, and struggling for every breath. Once he had carried her through snow, desperate and afraid. And now she was full of life, laughter spilling from her like a song. Thomas's chest ached with pride, and a quiet gratitude filled him, a gratitude for the widows, for their care, and for the unusual family they had created together. The widows themselves had changed too. They were no longer strangers who had arrived out of duty or necessity. Ayana had found purpose in the household, managing the ranch's animals and guiding Emily in practical skills. Naya, quiet and observant as ever, became the household's steady mind, offering wisdom and careful planning for every challenge. Lila, gentle and nurturing, became the emotional heart, ensuring that Emily felt safe and loved, while softening the tensions that occasionally arose among adults. Each had carved a space for herself, and each had gained the respect of the others, including Thomas, who now saw them not as helpers or obligation, but as equals, partners in life and survival. The outside world still whispered about them. Settlers who passed by would sometimes cast curious or disapproving looks, and rumors continued to spread. Some could not understand how a man could marry 3 women, even if it was for the sake of a child's life. Others judged without knowing the strength, sacrifice, and courage that had made the household possible. Thomas had long since stopped caring about those whispers. He knew that judgment meant little compared to the safety and happiness he had fought so desperately to create. His focus was not on the opinions of strangers, but on the lives that depended on him. Over time, even the Apache community came to recognize the household as a stable and honorable home. The widows had maintained their traditions and customs, teaching Emily the values of respect, courage, and care that had been passed down through generations. The elders saw that Thomas had upheld his promise, not out of greed or convenience, but out of responsibility and genuine dedication. Though he had entered their world as an outsider, he had earned their respect by keeping faith with his word and protecting the women and child entrusted to him. Emily thrived in this environment, her mind and body strengthened by lessons from all sides. She learned how to ride horses safely, care for the animals, understand the land, and even help the widows with small household tasks. But more than skills, she learned compassion, patience, and the importance of cooperation. She understood that family was not always about love at first sight, but about trust, care, and shared responsibility. She saw how the adults worked together, how disagreements could be solved without anger, and how courage sometimes meant quiet persistence rather than loud heroics. Thomas often reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He remembered the cold snow of that early winter, Emily's sickness, and the fear that had gripped him when he realized she might not survive. He remembered the first meeting with Ayana, Naya, and Lila, and the shock of learning the price for their help: marriage, not for love, but for survival. It had been a choice that no man in his right mind would make lightly, and yet it had saved a life. It had also created something unexpected, a family forged in hardship, bound by trust, and strengthened through sacrifice. There were moments of challenge even now. Arguments sometimes arose over chores or decisions about the ranch. Ayana could be strict, insisting that rules be followed exactly. Naya preferred careful observation before action, and Lila often took a softer, gentler approach. At first, Thomas had found these conflicts exhausting, but over the years he had learned to mediate and trust their judgments. He had realized that differences could be strengths if they were balanced, and that cooperation, patience, and respect were the true pillars of the household. Occasionally, outsiders would visit, curious or wary. Traders, neighbors, and travelers would sometimes ask questions, and Thomas would answer honestly, describing the unusual arrangement that had saved Emily's life. The widows would also speak when needed, their wisdom and calm presence reinforcing the household's stability. Many visitors were skeptical at first, but few could deny the harmony and respect that filled the home. It was clear that this was not a household of convenience, but one of genuine care and shared purpose. Emily grew up surrounded by love, even if that love was unconventional. She understood that her life had been saved by sacrifice, and she cherished the women who had given her that gift. Ayana, once distant and wary, had grown close to her, teaching her courage and the skills needed to survive in the wild. Naya, quiet and patient, taught Emily about observation, strategy, and problem-solving. Lila, gentle and nurturing, filled her days with stories, laughter, and kindness. Together, the three widows became more than protectors. They became role models, mentors, and mothers. In every way that mattered, Thomas, too, had learned to love in a different way. He realized that love did not have to be romantic to be meaningful. Respect, trust, and shared responsibility could form bonds just as strong, sometimes even stronger than passion or desire. He felt gratitude for the widows every day, recognizing the courage it had taken for them to join him in that unusual household. They had given Emily life, stability, and happiness, and they had given him a family that was resilient and united against all odds. As the years continued, the ranch prospered. The crops grew strong, the animals thrived, and the house became a home filled with warmth, laughter, and life. Emily matured into a thoughtful, confident young girl, her spirit shaped by the lessons of survival, courage, and cooperation. She learned to care for others, to respect traditions, and to value the strength of those around her. She knew the sacrifices that had been made for her life, and she carried that knowledge with humility and gratitude. Thomas often watched the widows together, noticing how they had become a unit of strength and support. They laughed softly, worked efficiently, and taught Emily lessons without resentment or complaint. He realized that this family, though unconventional, had achieved something rare: unity through trust and shared purpose. It was not always easy, and disagreements still arose, but the bonds between them were strong enough to endure every trial. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas sat outside the cabin with the widows and Emily. The air was warm, the sky painted with soft colors, and the animals grazed peacefully nearby. Emily ran across the yard laughing, her hair flowing in the wind. Thomas looked at her, then at the three women who had given her life, safety, and guidance. He felt a deep sense of peace. They had survived sickness, isolation, judgment, and danger. They had built a home together, one defined not by convention but by love in its many forms. Thomas knew that the world outside would never fully understand his household. Settlers, neighbors, and even some tribal members might question their choices, but inside the cabin there was no doubt they were a family. Their bonds were tested by hardship, strengthened by shared responsibility, and solidified by the care they showed for one another. Emily had grown up with stability, trust, and guidance. The widows had found purpose, respect, and safety. Thomas had found gratitude, partnership, and a sense of fulfillment he had never expected. Looking back on the years, Thomas understood that the unusual marriages had begun as a matter of survival. He had not loved the widows when he first married them, but the choice he had made saved his daughter's life. Over time, a deeper connection had grown. It was quiet, steady, and grounded in respect, trust, and care. It was a love born from sacrifice and shared experience rather than desire. And it was enough. By the time Emily was a young woman, strong and confident, the household had become a symbol of endurance and unity. The widows continued to teach her, guiding her through the complexities of life on the frontier. Thomas continued to lead the ranch with the wisdom he had gained, understanding that leadership was not about control, but about collaboration, respect, and care. Together, they had faced every challenge, and together they had created something extraordinary. A family forged not by chance or romance, but by courage, necessity, and devotion. In the quiet evenings, Thomas would sit by the fire, watching Emily and the widows, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He understood that life rarely unfolds as expected, that survival often requires hard choices, and that love can take many forms. His unusual household had faced sickness, judgment, danger, and fear, yet it had endured. It had flourished. It had become home. And Thomas knew, without a doubt, that every choice, every sacrifice, and every act of courage had been worth it. The world outside continued to move forward, with its judgments, challenges, and dangers. But inside the cabin there was safety, warmth, and love in its quietest, truest form. Emily thrived, the widows prospered, and Thomas found peace he had never known before. What began as a desperate measure to save a child's life had grown into a household stronger than anyone could have predicted. It was proof that family was not always defined by tradition or convention, but by commitment, courage, and care for one another. Years later, Thomas would tell Emily stories of the long winter when her life hung in the balance, of the promises he had made, and of the three women who had changed their lives forever. She would listen, understanding the weight of their history, the courage it had required, and the strength it had brought to all of them. And she would know, without doubt, that her unusual family, born of necessity, sustained by courage, and strengthened by love, was unbreakable.